Hi, this is Robert Wright. One thing I like about the conversations I have here on The Wright Show is that they help me think and write. They've informed the books and many of the articles I've written over the past 15 years. Now, lately, most of my writing has been for my newsletter, the Nonzero newsletter. It covers the kinds of topics you see on the show: politics, foreign policy, psychology, philosophy, spirituality, how to avoid the apocalypse, things like that. So if you enjoy The Wright Show, chances are pretty good that you'll enjoy the newsletter. It's free, and all you have to do to get it is go to nonzero.org and sign up. So I suggest that you hit pause, go sign up, and then hit play. Thanks. Hi, Paul.
Hi, Bob. How you doing?
I can't complain. Let me introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show, available on both streaming video and via audio podcast. You're Paul Bloom, famous psychologist at Yale, author of many books, at least one of which I think I plan to bring into play today as we talk. I'm going to leave you in suspense as to which one, Paul. Just let you worry. But first I want to say you've managed to get a haircut since last time you were on, we discussed the hair. Maybe we did it after we quit recording, and we discussed the haircut problem amid the pandemic, and I recommended that you transition toward a man bun. You have not done that. You've gotten, was that cut by a professional?
It was cut by my partner, who did a very professional job on it.
Yeah, it's not a real sculpted look, I would say. I mean, I'm not saying
I feel like you're setting me up for something. That cut
no, it just seems a little different from your average cut. I like it. It's a good. Yeah. Anyway, I digress. So here's the thing.
Somehow I feel like this is just. I just been insulted.
No.
This is going to be running on Twitter as a little clip.
No. Sculpted can be good. Sculpted can be bad.
Yeah.
Some people like Michelangelo.
I also did a whole COVID shave.
You know, I admire that, and I respect that, and I thank you for taking my platform so seriously. I can't say I did the same, but so here's the thing: there's no shortage of things going on in the world. There is, as we record this, there is civil unrest in the United States, as is well known. But when we arranged this podcast, we were not. We didn't know that was going to happen. We weren't planning to talk about it. And by and large, we're not going to. We're going to proceed as planned, talk about the other big story, pandemic, and maybe the psychology of some pandemic-related psychology. But at the end of this, I do want to talk a little about the civil unrest to the extent that you feel comfortable, and to the extent that your position as a Canadian, who in fact is in Canada as we speak, permits you to actually say anything of value. Not that it's impossible that a Canadian could say something of value about this, but it's a different perspective.
So I'm actually a citizen of both Canada and the United States. I carry 2 passports. I was born in Canada, but my mom was from the States, and I live in the States, given that I teach at Yale University. But it's true, I'm feeling very Canadian these days. I'm in Toronto for the duration. And maybe because of that, I really shouldn't opine on American matters. You Americans, if you're Donald Trump and you're Joe Biden, I don't know. There should be something about, people contributing foreign money to campaigns. What about foreign ideas?
You think that should be banned?
Maybe. Yeah. I'll tell you, a lot of people have asked me, how's the pandemic going in Toronto? And I would think, maybe surprisingly, at a concrete level, it's not any different from any big American city. We're opening up. I think a lot of people are wearing masks on the street, but some aren't. A lot of people are following social distancing, but some aren't. There's stories about, for instance, people illegally cutting hair.
Not that you know anyone who...
Not that I know. But if you know a guy, you could find somebody, you could kind of Uber over to their place, and they give you a little cut.
And if anybody needs a haircut, should they get in touch with you? Could your partner use a little extra?
No, I don't want to be the sort of middleman for those sorts of interactions, which are illegal.
Okay.
So day to day, it's kind of the same. I don't think it's substantially different from being in New Haven or New York or Princeton or wherever. There is a different feeling, even putting aside the current situation with the unrest, the police brutality, the riots, and all of that, which Canada is sort of not in the midst of. Even beyond that, there is a feeling of having relatively competent leadership.
Oh, and you're definitely talking about Canada right now, right?
I'm definitely talking about Canada. Mm-hmm. So, Justin Trudeau is the Prime Minister. Rob Ford is the Premier of Ottawa. Doug Ford.
I was going to say, isn't Rob Ford kind of not a good example of? It wasn't Rob Ford. He's not the crackhead.
He was the crackhead. Yes,
mayor.
He was a
crackhead mayor or something.
I think he was a crackhead mayor. I know Doug Ford is his brother.
Oh, really? But not a crackhead.
Not a crackhead. A very strong conservative views. Not well liked among the liberal community. Thought of as a bit of a wild man. But
not a crackhead.
And it's true. And he has stepped up. He has everybody says his leadership has been competent and serious. And the opposite of what you have in the United States. So just not having Trump looming over one is a sigh of relief. Now, there's no escaping Trump, but still, the feeling in Toronto is that we're under relatively rational management.
I think that's a feeling in a lot of countries.
Yeah.
That they're under relatively rational.
And, so at one point they said we're going to open up this at this time, and then they look at the data and say, no, we've changed our minds. It's going to be another week. Or this and that, and you have a feeling people are actually.
And people go, okay, you've probably thought about it.
Okay, you thought about it and everything, and the situation with Trump has never been good, and for everybody who says, well, how bad could it be? Now we know.
Tell me, when you were now, I gather until the pandemic, you were actually in New Haven to teach. Did you feel more? I don't want to say oppressed. Whatever the feeling is of living in a country that is whose president is Donald Trump, a feeling I think I can safely infer you find unpleasant. Yeah. Is there a big difference in being on the other? Like, is there a sense of escape once you cross the border and relief into Canada?
Yeah, it's not like all of a sudden. I'm reading everybody here. We talk about Trump. We talk about Biden. Half of the people I connect with are Americans or ex-Americans. So you don't get away from it. But there is a feeling of and of course, the president of the United States has power over the world. I mean, it plainly affects us. But still, the answer is yes. Yes, it is a relief to be in Toronto. You may want to consider crossing the border.
We thought about it.
Yeah.
Yep, we have good friends who own a cabin somewhere in the east, near water, near the Atlantic Ocean.
There's a fair amount of water in Canada.
Yeah, I'm told, and ice.
There's only one thing I'm discovering about Toronto. I don't want to get too much into what I'm up to personally, but suppose you wanted to get a house with, say, 2-3 bedrooms, maybe 2 bathrooms and everything. You wouldn't expect to have to pay, $1.5 million. But maybe you have to pay $1.5 million. And Vancouver, Canada's other wonderful city, is even worse. While Montreal, where I'm from, is more reasonable.
But you're not a francophone, right?
No, I'm not a francophone. I am one of les autres. I'm a Jewish Montrealer from.
Whatever house you're in now, I would stick with. I mean, you. I'm almost wondering if you've been doing CNN hits lately, because you look so much better than the average pandemic era guest on a cable news network. I mean, for our audio, or for our listeners, I just want to say you've got this little Victorian era stained glass lamp on one side. On the other side, big glass window that with a garden view, but not so bright that it's blowing out your face, the light. Yeah. Then these lovely flowers. Oh, and look, a ladder so that you can reach the highest levels of your extensive bookshelf. That's nice. I mean, look, I don't mean to get, I didn't mean to veer into critical, but it's just, I'm not saying it's too nice. It's at least nice enough.
So I assume you're making a little bit of fun of me, because if you don't like that, you could have this.
Oh, it was fake?
Yes.
You had me totally fooled.
I am very glad to hear that.
Oh, my God. No wonder the light wasn't blowing your face out. It was fake light.
So I prefer to move to this office.
Now it's more obvious.
Yes.
In this one. Now, maybe this is why I was saying your hair isn't very sculpted, because it had that little...
Oh, I see.
It had that aura around.
It gets cut off. Yes.
Okay.
Yes. So, so basically, a lot of academics I know, particularly those without young kids, have taken advantage of the pandemic to get research done and write scientific papers. Me, I've been doing a lot of Zoom backgrounds. So I got some Zoom movie backgrounds and Zoom thing backgrounds. It could take up a lot of time.
Yeah. The first one was really, really compelling.
I'm glad you like it. The people who are listening to this, they are really going to be disappointed.
Well, I tried to do such a lovely oral rendition of the scene that they'll feel as if they were there. But maybe you're right. Maybe we should start getting less visual, more conceptual. So speaking of the pandemic, do you feel that it's your role as a psychologist, Paul, to tell us all how to think about the pandemic? So we spoke a little bit about this, and there's among a community of psychologists, there are varying reactions to the pandemic. So a lot of us are publishing about it, are writing theoretical articles and empirical articles. My understanding is there's been a publication bump where a lot of people are publishing a lot of papers, particularly social psychologists, mostly social psychologists, some clinical psychologists, mostly social psychologists, where they opine and report experiments on the effects of COVID on our society, on us. They make projections. I often get papers to review coming out like twice a day. I get requests. And often I'm told, this is an expedited thing. We'd like your review very quickly, like 2-3 days, because of the urgency of the situation. And probably the biggest thing was there was a paper published by a couple of dozen of top academics in Nature Human Behavior, one of our big journals. And it included, I was led by Jay Van Bavel, a friend of mine, social psychologist at NYU. I think you know. I've had him on, yeah.
A really smart guy. I had an all-star cast, like Cass Sunstein was in the paper and other people in the paper. And it just summarized what psychologist tells us about COVID. And to be perfectly honest, there's another paper which is under review that I am an author on, which we lay our opinions about what psychology tells us. But there's a backlash. And despite the fact that I'm part of the problem, I'm also a little bit sensitive to the backlash. And the backlash is we are running our mouths off on things we just don't know that much about.
When you say sensitive, you mean you're a little sympathetic to the backlash?
I'm a little bit sympathetic to it.
Yeah.
I'm a little bit sympathetic to it. I think Jay has talked a lot about this on Twitter. He makes the point saying, look, our ideas are imperfect, our research is imperfect, but it's better to have imperfect information, imperfect ideas, than none at all.
And to have mere mortals opining on the pandemic.
People like you.
Right.
But my worry is people take our work much too seriously. And we are
Can
very
I just add,
imperfect.
that's not as big a problem in psychology as it was 5 years ago? But
it's true.
The discipline has had a couple of problems.
Yeah. So you think I'm trying to think too much of myself to say it's a big problem how people treat us like gods.
Yeah. Well, I'm not saying. I'm just saying it's more like demigods now. I guess I would say, after the replication crisis than it was before. But
yeah, and so there's a really nice paper by a very heated blog post by Stuart Ritchie, outlining the case against psychologists, and other things have started to appear in journals. Some psychologists are upping their publication rate by publishing articles attacking those other psychologists who are writing articles. But I mean, take the paper that Jay wrote, which I think is really interesting, and the sort of paper I could use as a resource in many ways. So even there's a section on conspiracy theories about COVID. And that's sort of, for me, a go-to thing. I want to read the psychology of conspiracy theories. So I think it's great it was published. But at the beginning of the paper, they list a bunch of policy recommendations. And without exception, the policy recommendations are stuff you didn't need a psychologist to tell you. It's stuff like when trying to communicate health information, people defer to trusted sources. People are persuaded by a combination of the emotions and reason. Often in times of trouble, people retreat to their in-group, but not always. And there's nothing there to make you gasp. To the extent that sometimes they say controversial things in the article, I don't believe them. But it just seems to be in some way a sort of liberal folk wisdom, not reasonable ideas, with the sort of stamp of science behind it. And there are worse things, but it's not like you have experts on viruses talking about COVID. No, tell you things you didn't know before that are really serious and important. We don't do that yet.
Now, the Ritchie piece, I think that's the one I glanced at that you sent me the link to. He seemed to be pointing to a number of cases where psychologists and or other academics, such as Cass Sunstein, as I recall, just kind of got it wrong. In other words, they came out of the gate pretty fast in the early phase and warned against excessive concern, excessive anxiety, and in retrospect, they themselves arguably understated the actual extent of the risk and the severity of the crisis, right?
Yeah. And you could say that the part they got wrong was in psychology. But, so if they said, like, people are panicking about this, it's plainly not a pandemic, people are overreacting, let's explore what goes on in that. But I think there's a real criticism here to be made, though, which is if your theory is powerful enough, powerful in the sort of way that it could explain, as it were, anything somebody does, from taking it too seriously to not seriously enough, no matter what you do, I have an explanation for it. You're not really explaining anything. If you say, oh, I don't care about the pandemic, I'm not following social distancing, it's just, and I say, as a psychologist, I could nail down that's exactly what I would expect you to do. And if you say you're freaking out and panicking and overdoing, and I say, and as a psychologist, I explain that's exactly what I would expect you to do. I'm not explaining anything.
No, on the other hand, if some people do freak out and some don't, or people freak out under some circumstances, not others, in principle, psychology should have an explanation of why sometimes one happens and not. Now, as you put it, I could have predicted that. That could turn out to be a pretty weaselly thing. But in theory, psychology should have all the answers. I guess. That's the business we're in. Yeah. There's the Karl Popper idea that you distinguish science from bullshit or from anything else in terms of falsifiability. Science makes claims that could be proven false. Now, nobody takes that seriously as an absolute demarcation. There's all sorts of reasons why real science might make claims that are very hard to falsify. But the general idea is true, which is if somebody comes at you with a claim, and no matter what you do, they have a claim, they would capture it. They're not really telling you anything interesting. And too much of our psychology is like that. And then there's a more local issue I become a little bit interested in, which is there are people who are making very, very optimistic claims about how this is going to affect us. A friend of mine, Jamil Zaki, this brilliant professor at Stanford, has coined a term, I think it's a catastrophe compassion, and ways in which we are getting better and nicer to each other. And I think that's a really nice perspective on the world. It's very positive, as Jamil is. I think the evidence for that is actually very weak. So is the idea that in days of yore, you would hear about an earthquake halfway around the world and say, oh, screw them, but now you send them money or something?
There's different ideas. One idea is that this global pandemic has brought us all together.
That's not consistent with my own observations, but maybe I'm spending too much time in America. Go ahead. So it's true in some sense. This meets up with the obvious fact that people are experiencing it in very different ways. You are experiencing it in a beautiful house lined with books, but if you were in India, these are real books, by the way.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, in the end, does it really matter?
No.
If
you haven't read them, nope.
By the way, you should be able to curate your Zoom bookshelf to choose exactly the right books for in there. That is an idea which is going to make somebody a lot of money after listening to me right now. If
I were you, I would turn to that as soon as we finish this conversation.
So, in a way, we're experiencing it very differently, and the statistics bear this out. Men die more than women. Blacks die more than whites.
In the long run, I would say men can't die more than women, but I take your point. I see. Of COVID. Okay. I'm sorry. I thought I was making a very subtle but astute point.
Like arguing with a Jesuit.
Okay. Sorry. Pandemic. Yeah.
If you're rich and living in a mansion, you're going to experience a pandemic very differently than someone who's poor. But on the other hand, I have never had an experience in my life where the whole world was experiencing this. I read this New York Times headline, and it said, it was like a month ago, half the world is on lockdown. And I think, half the freaking world?
Wow. Is that true?
It's New York Times.
I guess, because nominally, like, India's on lockdown, right?
Yeah. Big country.
A lot of people.
China, a lot of China. And, So yeah, in that sense, I feel this commonality. I mean, what else is the same thing? I mean, if you're, I'm sure everybody in the world heard about the September 11th attacks, but, if you're a commodities trader in Nairobi, maybe whatever, you hear about it and you wonder what affects you. And if you're somewhere, you may not matter. The death of Princess Diana, even World War II, affects everybody in the world in a different way, and some not at all.
Yeah.
This affects just about everybody. And so it's not crazy to say it could bring us together in that way.
Well, it's not crazy. I mean, it is a non-zero-sum problem. In theory, we can benefit from cooperating. At the same time, there are zero-sum aspects as usual. If there aren't enough surgical masks for everyone in the world, that's a zero-sum game, and so on. So, but in a kind of generic way, you would hope that a common peril that, it's not zero-sum in the sense that when someone gets sick anywhere in the world, to some extent, that is bad for me. To some, however infinitesimally, it actually increases the chances that I will eventually get the disease. So it is non-zero-sum in that minimal sense, but, I've got to say, I mean, and this is a real, just disappointment of mine that you would hope that both internationally and intranationally it might have a cohesive effect, but it seems to me mainly it's had the opposite. I mean, the two most salient group psychological features of it, to me, are almost like the tribalization of it in America, the kind of the way it has in synergy with the polarization, the political polarization that we had even before it. It has created two seemingly different perspectives on it, depending on whether you're in red America or blue America.
Yeah.
Not that that's an entirely consistent effect, but statistically, it's pretty. It's actually
enormous, the difference between how people answer the question of is lockdown justified? Should you wear a mask? What's going to happen next? By knowing whether somebody is Republican or Democrat, you predict an enormous amount about it.
Now, to some extent, that reflects their actual accurate assessment of the situation. In other words, people, whether you're in a red part of a blue state or of a red state, you are less likely to be imperiled, at least certainly in the early stages, because it was largely an urban thing. So, that's not just partisan psychology, but it clearly has taken on a partisan dimension, and that's been to some extent stoked by politicians, none of whom we need name, and there have been politicians on both sides. But then internationally, we seem to be on the verge of a Cold War with China. I mean, it's like this may create not that this is the only factor, and in some ways the ground had already been prepared for this, but this could be an epic cleavage in the world that lasts for decades. Yep. And where once again, as during the Cold War, there are trade blocks. That's what a number of people in America are advocating. It's like we should just trade with democracies. We should whatever. And so I'm not highly optimistic person, but I have to say, I think even I have been slightly disappointed.
And it could have turned out differently. We could have had a different leader.
Well, different leadership, and not only presidential leadership, in Congress too, but certainly presidentially could have been different.
We could have not had an election coming up.
That too. That is totally amped up the anti-China rhetoric because it's like dueling nationalism along this dimension, at least between Biden and Trump in their ads. No, I mean, Trump, it's like I was thinking, people have, this is getting back to the other big story of the day, but people have been saying, where's the leadership from Trump on the nation is in flames, the cities are in flames. I'm not sure, given how much polarization we have and how polarizing he is, I'm not sure there's anything. Well, it's two questions. Is there a speech he could give that would be unifying? I'm not sure the answer to that is yes. And then there's the question of, is there a speech that he plausibly could want to give that would be unifying? I'm pretty sure the answer to that is, well, I don't know. But it's, so both of these problems have arrived at a time when at least America was in no position to address anything with unity, I guess I would say.
And as you said, this would be the situation that has extraordinary potential for a non-zero sum analysis and for a solution that would benefit everybody. This is actually old social psychology 101, which is everything we know about in-group and out-group behavior says the way to bring the whole planet together is for the aliens to attack. And then we will all come together with a common enemy. Right. Well, now we have the common enemy, and look what's happened. And, there were signs that could have been promising. I think there was a case where China donated a lot of mass and health equipment to another country, and there were these donations across nations. And, it could have gone that way. It could have, but it does not seem to be looking that way.
Now, in Canada, what's the attitude toward China these days? In America, it has turned pretty sharply negative. That's what the polls say. Is that
on the left as well?
I don't know on the left, but if you look at I'm sure to some extent on the left, yes. But if you look at just the aggregate national numbers, it's like a big swing in terms of how many people view China negatively. It's a clear majority now.
Yeah, I haven't seen polling data. I have seen data that you just talked about, the red-blue distinction in the States, looking at a conservative liberal distinction in Canada and how that affects how they think about COVID-related issues. And the answer is it actually has very little effect. There's a slight difference in how much they blame Trudeau for not acting properly and so on. But the differences are not enormous, and it's just, most people, this is not politicized in Canada to the same extent. And so I would guess based on that, nobody's talking about China. Nobody's, and in part it's because Canadian politics isn't the same as American politics, where American politics is sort of fundamentally connected to the world in a way that everyone's observing, and not so much in Canada. But I sometimes think whether the fact that that there's a two-party system in the States turns everything bad in a way you don't get with places that have multiple parties. Because there's not this sort of Manichean. Is that the word? Manichean?
Manichean, I think.
Manichean. Yeah. I only read things, I'm a guy who would mispronounce words because I only read them. But Manichean.
There's a surprising amount of that now. But I digress.
Surprising amount? Like, what do you mean?
I was just listening to this book by Ross Douthat, a very good book. And what word did he? Oh, damn it! It'll come to me. But he's young, and it seems to me more common among young people. And it just surprises me because I had thought of them as very oral and like absorbing a lot of things on YouTube and blah and blah. Yeah. But you hear among younger people, such as yourself. Not that I never did this. So never mind. It is. I'm sorry, I interrupted you. I'll shut up. Go ahead.
No, it's bringing back this memory, I think, from college where I said, to appear smart, I said epitome. And everybody looked at me.
Oh, that reminds me of, what did I say? Goethe? You've heard of the German writer Goethe?
Yeah, why not Goethe?
Why not Goethe? It looks like Goethe.
It's like Goethe. How are you supposed to resolve that from first principles?
Man, and I was afflicted rightly with imposter syndrome. I mean, I had come from like an alien culture into a, Eastern, anyway.
As a psychologist, Bob, you're talking to the right guy.
Scars are still there. So back to Manichaeanism.
So the hypothesis, which all I have, I'm just basing this on like the single example, but it's not a bad prediction to say any place that's going to have only two parties, or effectively two parties, the parties will polarize the country because you have to choose sides. There's an in-group and an out-group, one of each, and then you're kind of locked in. Well, if a place has multiple parties, like Canada and like most countries, or at least more than one, which also has its problems, but multiple political parties, you don't have to choose in the same way. There's no immediate enemy, If you're a liberal, you might be against NDP, you might be against the conservatives. It's more complicated. And there's coalitions and there's this and there's that.
You have a parliamentary system, and that's different.
Yeah,
and I think better personally, but
it has its advantages.
Yeah.
So to go back to the sort of optimism, there's another thing, which is, I think, connects a lot to your interests, but there's a book by, I might have it here, by...
Paul, those books are fake. Do not look around.
No,
oh, you mean in your real environment, the one I can't see.
Let me reach back.
By the way, what does your real environment look like? I'm curious. Can you just turn that off?
I can.
Are you ashamed? Are you ashamed, Paul?
Well, now I'm wondering exactly what I should have actually.
Well, anyway, don't reach for one of those books because they ain't there. Okay.
But here I will do this. How's that?
Oh my God! How barren! Yeah. No wonder you wanted to conceal that. Give me the books. Put the books back.
The books are back.
Oh God, that was depressing.
I'm actually, Bob, in a minimum security prison right now.
I was going to say, can I help you with bail or something?
Yeah, it does. It actually has a sort of Batman asylum look. It's very pretty, the view out here. It's the city of Toronto and everything, but behind me is kind of stark. Anyhow.
Your credibility is a little low on what your environment is actually like, but go ahead and say what you will.
I'm going to move to a different Zoom background so you can see this. Rebecca Solnit, I think that's her name, has a book called A Paradise Built in Hell. And Sebastian Junger in his book Tribe, they both make the same point, which is people think that for disasters, there's chaos and panic and so on, like Hurricane Katrina, or the London Blitz, or the subway bombings in Europe and so on. But in fact, for the most part, when there's disasters, you often see people at their best. They get together, they work together. Apparently, a lot is anecdotal, but rates of depression and anxiety disappear. Mm-hmm. There are many people after the Blitz in London, when the Germans bombed them for like 70 days and they went underground and everything, described it as the finest time of their life. Mm-hmm. Like really sincerely. And it made them connected into other people. They felt they were actually doing good.
Oh, yeah.
And so it's a reasonable enough model. And the psychologists I'm talking about have applied this model and say, well, wouldn't this happen here? Shouldn't this happen here? Isn't this good news for how we'll remember the pandemic? But the problem is there's a special cruelty to the situation where we're plainly not on the streets, pulling bodies out of buildings, joining hands in song, marching through together. We are, for the most part, and things are changing, we're getting out a bit now, but for the most of the pandemic, we were locked in isolation.
Right.
The nicest things we did were retweet something or tip the delivery guy something extra. There's no, very few of us have pandemic memories of great solidarity and courage and risk and so on.
No, there weren't the opportunities to help each other out. I mean, because you had to stay away from everyone. It's like, can I borrow a cup of sugar? No, stay the hell away from my front porch.
Yeah. And people, teachers drove by their kids' house, their students' houses and honked the horn. All these sweet actions. People in the city of New York would cheer the workers every day at a certain time and all that. It was very nice. Yeah. But it's not the Blitz. Yeah. It's not Hurricane Katrina. It's not 9/11. And analogizing the situation now to those things, I think, is a mistake.
Yeah, I mean, contagion is just a distinctive property. It's like if you face a common enemy, even if it's inanimate, like whether it's climate change or like a foreign invading power, it's just by and large not the case that it's very easy for you to harm your neighbor in the course of interaction. This is just a distinctive property that does exert a certain kind of divisive effect, I guess. Now, on this piece you were talking about that critiqued these psychologists, it seemed like one unifying theme in the pieces being critiqued was, or at least among a lot of them, was warning people against uncritically following their emotional guides. Like, okay, you're scared. I understand, but you have to understand this. Now, I mean, first of all, I have some sympathy for that, because it seems to me I spend a certain amount of time trying to talk people out of being as worried as they are. But I would think you would too, because, and here's the book I said I was going to mention. It's called Against Empathy, which is, as I recall, an endorsement of human suffering and cruelty. Is that a fair? No, that wasn't it. That wasn't it. What it was an argument that uncritically following your feelings of empathy can mislead you, can lead society to misplace its resources, can lead people into various kinds of trouble. So you're broadly...
That's a good summary.
You're broadly sympathetic to the idea that our emotions are often not good guides.
Yes. I believe, like everyone else who thinks about this, that emotions are an essential part of life. If you strip emotions away from a person, you would lose too much. You'd lose a lot of what makes us human. You'd also lose, I think, what helps people in deliberation, which is often a push and pull of different feelings. But emotions often lead us to make stupid decisions. Our gut misleads us. I was once asked people they had this big question, if you could have a billboard which had a single sort of, put any words on a billboard everybody would see, what would you put? And for me to be, don't listen to your heart. And the pandemic is a good case of that. I think particularly with regards to the underreaction. And here I am doing what I'm accusing other people of doing, which is I'm not going to explain everything since I know how it all turned out, but people underreacted. And I think one reason why they underreacted is it's not so frightening. It's really hard to walk around and see everybody is okay. Mm-hmm. And the world seems the sun is shining. People are, and being told you have to stay inside. There's an invisible threat. This invisible threat, you will get sick from people who are not sick, who do not look sick. And it will cause you, and it's just, didn't feel right. And I think a lot of people who ended up protesting against the social distancing said, it doesn't feel like there was a threat. It doesn't feel like we resolved anything. So it was all Bill Gates' fault. And so our emotions can lead us astray in overrating fears, which happens when we're afraid of flying or afraid of snakes and so on. But it can also cause us to underrate things because our emotions don't plug in exponential growth.
Right. And I mean, another distinctive thing about this that I think helps explain why the sheer number of deaths maybe hasn't translated in some corners into the amount of alarm you'd expect is it does afflict older people. And I mean, the numbers are really quite striking. I think in America, 35% or something, or in the 35, 40 something percent of the people who died have been in nursing homes, and maybe more. I don't know. And, there's a couple of things. One is just, if you're a strict utilitarian and ask, well, how many decades of human life have been lost? It's 100,000 deaths, average age 60 is very different from 100,000 deaths, average age 16. But aside from being utilitarian, this is the way human beings naturally respond. I don't know if you remember, there was a study I cited in The Moral Animal where, in fact, I think it was a Canadian psychologist, but who was it? It was a Canadian, so maybe you would recognize the study. So what they calculated was that, from a cold Darwinian perspective, in other words, the perspective that you might expect natural selection to imbue us with, there's a very big difference between losing a 1-month-old child and losing an 18-year-old child. An 18-year-old child, strictly speaking, it isn't that you've invested all of this in the upbringing. Strictly speaking, it's the replacement cost of creating another, if you will, sorry, but we're talking Darwinian terms, another asset, another reproductive asset of that value. In other words, 18 years old, ready to go, how long is it, how much time and effort is going to take you to create another one? And so they predicted that when the ages at which the loss of offspring, should be most, unfortunate from a Darwinian perspective, and therefore you might think would be most painful emotionally, would lead to the most grief. And then they did this study that seemed consistent with the theoretical expectation. And in my book, I looked at Darwin's own reactions to the deaths of his different children. Some right after childbirth, one, his beloved Annie, when she was like either 8 or 10. Anyway, that's all. I don't know if this doesn't ring a bell. You're not an author of this paper.
I'm not, even though it's Canadian.
Yeah, no. I mean, the author doesn't spring to mind. I can find it.
But I've heard of that research. There's been other studies since looking at intuitions about age. And yeah, you're right. I don't know the precise research, but it's actually theoretically very interesting because it's a nice test of certain evolutionary hypotheses. Mm-hmm. It might predict, for instance, that you would think your judgments would be different if these people in question were your children versus strangers.
Well, sure, yeah.
It might predict a sex difference. Yeah. So with regard to thinking about girls versus boys, it'd be very surprising. We'd like to imagine we're egalitarian when it comes to this, but when you test it right, you might find differences. It's really interesting. And I'm a utilitarian too. So this comes up a lot less now these days, but during the darkest points of the pandemic, the question of do you save a 30-year-old or a 70-year-old? And there's actually some research out of a lab asking people these questions and getting their intuitions. There are some people who think you shouldn't prefer one over the other, like first come, first serve. There are some utilitarians, and I'm one of them, who thinks you should do prioritizing based on amount of years left. But, and here I think you'll agree with me, I'm a utilitarian on these things, but I want to distance myself from people who take an extremely cavalier attitude towards the death of the elderly, of which I see some of this on social media, like, who cares? Once you're past 70, once you're past 80, just die already. It doesn't matter. I am extremely close to my father and my aunt, both who are in their 80s, and I want very much for them to be healthy. And it'd be a tragedy if they got sick, and I would do a lot so they don't get sick. At the same time, I think that it matters more. It would be less of a tragedy to die when you're 85 than when you're 35.
Well, there's also the fact that with this disease, you have this weird feature where you don't, if you have an older loved one dying, you don't get to have physical contact with them as they're dying, or maybe at all before they're dying. My father, when he died, we were all with him physically, and that meant a lot. Yeah. This is a horrible feature of this, and it can really change, I'm sure, alter exactly how painful the memory of it is, because there's really something valuable, even if you're not with them when they die, and being able to go in, say the last thing you want to say, whatever. It's
heartbreaking, these things. I've heard stories like that, and then the funerals over video conferencing, I don't need to remind you, we're mammals. Contact is really important.
Yeah.
And not being able to touch somebody, to hug them, to hold them.
No, I just saw my daughters, today for the first time in a month. And it's weird. I'd be happy to. I'm not, they're mainly worried about them infecting me. Oh. I don't really care about, no, that's not true. That's not true. I just mean I'm not as apprehensive about that. I do not want to get sick and die. Don't get me wrong, but I don't feel as apprehensive, but they don't want to do it. And so, it is kind of strange.
It's kind of strange. It's, and this is, you know, you were saying before, everybody experiences this differently. And for everybody like me, who's gone through this fairly unscathed, I mean, you know, I sit at home and I type in my computer, I talk to people by Zoom, which is not enormously different from my life is regularly in non-pandemic times. But for every person like me, you know, there's so many people who have had, you know, lost their job, lost their livelihood, lost their business, or had some sort of specific tragedy, like had somebody die on them and couldn't see their loved one. You know, and it's even in the small scale, it grates on me. I was hoping to see my son in Connecticut, my older son, and you know, but if I had to leave, and I probably might be safe to do so, but if I leave Canada, when I come back, I'll have to go through quarantine.
Oh, really?
And, you know, I don't want to spend, you've seen how beautiful my house is, but still, I don't want to spend 14 days.
Oh, yeah, that Victorian lamp, I wouldn't leave that for the world.
It's midday, it's beautiful, the birds chirping and everything.
I can almost hear them. So, yeah, it's, what else is there? And I don't know, this weird, you know, the weird, and I don't know to the extent to which this, I mean, first of all, it seems like it may go on for a very long time now, barring a vaccine, that there will be some risk associated with normal human interaction. Yeah,
so I got, you know, I can do this. I got a mask. It's a Batman one. I got kind of a fancier one. I got masks. By the way, it's really unpleasant to wear a mask. I
is. You know, I did it for the very first time yesterday because I actually went to a place of business. It was a nursery. I wasn't indoors, but even so. And I have to say it's a pretty good looking mask. But you know, and you do wonder how much the psychology of the lockdown, whether that has interacted with the civil unrest. I mean, it's something I'm hearing now. People speculating that you know, cabin fever has contributed to the intensity of this. I don't really have any way of knowing, but it seems plausible.
I don't know either. It could interact in the other way, which is a lot of the unrest might lead to people getting COVID who wouldn't otherwise get it.
That's been speculated too, and that seems that's bound to be the case to at least some extent. Although a lot of people are wearing masks. I mean, you know, it's funny. I hadn't anticipated. I was having a conversation with Mickey Kaus, and I was saying, it was in the context of Hong Kong, and I was saying, well, I guess the pandemic is kind of hard on the protesters because if they have to do social distancing, it's hard to have a really impressive high-density protest. But now I realize to the extent that there is going to be actual civil disobedience or whatever you want to call it when people break the law, whether it's violating curfew, smashing windows, it's actually pretty handy to have a mask on.
It's a very bizarre point of history where protesters would be breaking the law if they took off their masks.
And they would be more likely to be caught for breaking another law if they didn't have the convenience of having to wear a mask. I mean, I'm sure that emboldens some people.
Yeah. There's, you know, back to psychology, there's various studies showing that people, when they hide their face, they lose some individuality. Yeah. There's a psychology of mob behavior, of group behavior. And simply putting on a mask makes you feel like a bit less of your own person and more part of a crowd.
Well, there's a famous scene in To Kill a Mockingbird where there's a lynch mob at the jailhouse. At least this is in the play. I'm not sure if it's in the novel, but and they're wearing Klan masks.
Yeah.
And once it's Scout, the daughter, who first says, "Hey, aren't you so and so?" and identifies one of them, and their identity is known. And then I think maybe one of them takes off a mask, another does, and the mob dynamic dissolves to the extent that they lose their anonymity. So you would hope. So I don't know. Strange times, and I don't know. And it's like right now we're taping this on Monday. It'll probably post Tuesday. Last night, I felt as if the unrest was losing momentum. And I think last night was less turbulent than the night before, but it's clearly not over, and you never know because any given thing could revive the momentum, including just some misstep by a cop or something.
Yeah, of which there already have been.
There already have been, but there haven't been fatal ones yet.
So in what makes this worse is, and again, I know I'm harping on Trump, but it is what it is. Trump has absolutely no interest in defusing this. He has no interest in bringing people together in actually addressing the deep, problems with race that America has. Trump feeds off of it. And I'm not saying he would probably rather not be in this situation, hiding in the White House as protesters, are charging the gates. He's probably not delighted with this, but the way he'll use it is to further dichotomize and get Americans in oppositional ways, further, embolden white supremacy and all of those very worst sides of Trumpism.
Well,
that's his natural move.
His instincts are, he just has kind of polarizing instincts. Now, Steve Bannon claims that on the night of the election, when it was clear he'd won, there was a moment when Trump wanted to come out as the grand unifier and not be aggressive in terms of policy and so on, and was genuinely surprised to find the next day that there were these vehement protesters who seemed to want to, burn down Trump Tower or whatever, and that came as a genuine shock to Trump, which is an interesting comment in itself, that he thought all would be forgiven. But apparently, according to Bannon, he really had for that moment that wish, but in any event, it's not fundamentally in his nature. I think it's safe to say. I
think to a large extent, Trump is apolitical, and Trump has these deep appetites. But if things were different, he could come off as a member of the extreme left. There was a point during his horrible press conferences during COVID where the issue of forgiving student loans came up, and he said he was going to forgive him temporarily. And I said, I've been thinking about forgiving him forever. And somehow if that won him applause, he would do that.
Oh,
because he doesn't drop some deep fiscal conservatism or ideas of responsibility. He's unpredictable. He does what works. I'm watching this TV show, The Great. Have you seen this?
No, it's called The Great?
It's based on Catherine the Great, a sort of fictionalized history. A lot of fun. But the main character is Peter the Great. And he's one of the main characters of Catherine the Great. And he's played as this monster. But deep down, he's just immensely insecure and is tremendously hurt by people who don't love him. And he wants to be loved. And he's doing terrible things to be loved. You see a bit of that in Trump. So much what's happening to Trump is his feelings get hurt. Yeah.
I think above all, he wants attention, first of all. That's one of his primary drive. He wants attention every day. I think he'd be happy to be held in high esteem, and I think he'd probably prefer that. I don't think he's so abnormal that he'd rather be disliked than liked. I just think it's if you put him in an environment where the way to get attention and hold it is for a lot of people to dislike him, even as a lot of other people like him, he'll go with that. He'd rather have attention that entails a pretty large amount of antagonism than no attention at all. That's my part of my theory of Trump anyway.
Yeah. And, whatever the weaknesses with Biden suffers from none of these pathologies. And
not the same ones, no.
He's a politician. So he has his love for attention and his love of being loved. But you could imagine him, and he's doing his steps now, trying to, reconcile people, trying to word this out, certainly showing, an enormous amount of sympathy for the protesters.
Oh, yeah. Well, of course, that's more. Given his constituency, he kind of has to. Not to be too cynical, but how is he? Is there a take on Biden in Canada? There's a certain amount of concern among people in America who would like Trump not to be president that, you've heard the basic concerns about Biden.
Yeah. I don't talk to enough Canadians to know.
Yeah.
But, I have not been following this. Is there further development on his VP pick?
No, I think the thinking is that after one of his more recent missteps where he tried to explain to a black man how black men should behave.
Was this one who said he's not really black if he votes for Trump?
He said if you got to think about who to vote for between me and Trump, you ain't black.
I like the ain't.
The ain't was a good touch. Different from some forms of white splaining. But I think the thinking is that made it more likely. And maybe that's overly near-term thinking. Next week there will be another screw-up, and we'll see how that shapes the likelihood of the pick. But the thinking was that increased the chances of an African-American. Yeah. Maybe Kamala Harris. Thinking is also that the civil unrest works against Amy Klobuchar because she was a prosecutor in Minnesota. I mean, this police department was in her jurisdiction. I gathered there were complaints against this officer that I think the claim is that it would have been within her discretion to pursue, but I don't know. Maybe this is just some of it.
I've heard that as well.
So who knows? He has said it's going to be a woman.
Yes,
and I think a woman of color has become, if anything, more likely since he said that it would be a woman. And
he also said that a Supreme Court nominee would be a woman of color. So
did he?
For her, that's the same debate. The same debate with Bernie was he was very specific on that, suggesting maybe he has somebody in mind. But,
there goes my shot at the court, I guess.
Yeah, you'll just have to wait for the next administration after that.
Yeah. So anything else? Such a weird time.
It is such a weird time. Not a good time, actually.
No. Now, I was just thinking the classic, you mentioned the expectation, a certain amount of actual psychological evidence that common threats can bring people together. A classic experiment, and I don't know, you tell me, I think this experiment has also undergone a certain amount of reevaluation, as so many classic experiments have, including like the Stanford prison experiment. But the Robbers Cave experiment.
Yeah.
Where they
Mustafa
actually,
Sharif.
you would never be able to do this experiment now, but they took a whole bunch of boys in summer camp who didn't even know they were part of an experiment. Subjected these two, they created two groups. They gave them names. I don't know, the
Rattlers and the Eagles.
The Rattlers and the Eagles. And for a while, systematically sowed antagonism between them. Like, I think they would do things like say, hey, there's going to be a picnic, come to the picnic. And one group would get there. The other group had already gotten there, eaten all the food and left or something. Stuff like that, right. Where they would make them hate each other. Supposedly even fights broke out. But then they showed that you put them in a non-zero-sum game. You tell them that the water pipe to the camp is broken down, a threat that they all face, and they will cheerfully work together. I don't know how much that's held up, but it is kind of the classic example of an external threat that is not in human form, which is important because a lot of threats aren't. Climate change isn't. But a threat not in human form exerts a unifying effect. Is that experiment now also viewed askance?
Yeah, it's also viewed askance. It's people have questioned the veracity of the story. It's a good story. It's maybe too good a story. There are all these attempts. So one you would enjoy with your interest in zero-sum and non-zero-sum interactions is each of the boys sent an emissary, and they would meet and have like a summit. And then they would agree, the ambassadors would agree to have everybody go together. Then the ambassadors went back to their own group, and their own group shunned them for that. The experimenters did things like they said they had like a knife throwing competition. This is very different times. But that's the story. The narrative is when faced with this common threat, people come together. But I think you put your finger on something, which I don't know if there's research on this, but I bet it makes a difference if the common threat is a person, is individual.
Oh, I would think.
I think we have powerfully evolved coalitional psychology that if somebody attacks you, it's just such a profound emotions come up that don't come up if you get sick, if your building collapses on you. I keep meaning to do a study on this, but when people die due to a terrorist attack, governments give their families enormous amounts of money to compensate. So in 9/11, if you were in the building that came down, the U.S. government would give your family a staggering amount of money. If at the same moment you were in another part of town and then you fell down the stairs and broke your neck, they won't give you anything.
It was just as much a piece of bad luck.
Exactly. You're just as dead, but you're not dead because of a bad person. And you're not dead as part of a bad person who afflicted the whole nation in a particularly threatening and psychologically activating way. Yeah. And so it's yet another reason why this pandemic might not have the sort of, well, for better or worse, might not have the same effect as we're together being attacked by a common enemy. We use war as a metaphor. We're at war with COVID. We're at a war on poverty, war on cancer. And it's a metaphor because we try to get the feelings you get with a real war and extend them to these other domains. But you need to use the metaphor because it's just not natural. It's not how we normally feel.
No, it's hard. And I've a big part of my hobby horse is these various inanimate, non-human threats that afflict the world as a whole and are, in principle, an argument for international, cooperation, global governance in some sense or another. And one of them is very close to what the pandemic was, and that is actual biological warfare. The threat, the fact that more and more people in more and more places do have the capacity to engineer, lethal germs that could be highly contagious. And what kills me about what's happened is the pandemic may be creating this huge division in the world between the West and China, or between the U.S. and China, and you need cooperation across that chasm and across all the international chasms if you're going to do the kind of innovative kind of global governance it would take to really get a fix on the problem of biological weapons. So, ironically, this may increase the chances of dying at the hands of a lethal pathogen.
You really are a fount of good cheer.
I am a cheerful person, and this is why people choose to hang out with me.
There was this expert, I forget his name, that actually Sam Harris talked to in his podcast, and the guy was cheerful throughout about the whole thing. And then Sam said, so this is going to be no big deal, I guess, you're sound. And I said, oh no, maybe 100,000, hundreds of thousands of people will die. But this is nothing compared to a bird flu that kills 60% of people.
Right.
And so the guy said, reasonably enough, on balance, utilitarian balance, this could be the best thing that could have ever happened to us.
Because it'll alert us to the larger threat.
If because of this, we put in preparations so that a flu that could actually be a species-ending event, that we could cope with that, this would have been a blessing. But I look at how we're coping with this, and I don't know. I think if there was another situation we had to move to lockdown, we'd be able to do it quicker and more efficiently.
Yeah.
You'd imagine that certainly a Biden administration would put together things in place.
Yeah.
Do you think this is going to put us in any way better equipped for climate change, respond to climate change, or make no effect?
That's a good question. I will concede, in light of what you just said, that it could, in some ways, give us a stronger infrastructure for withstanding a biological weapons attack. But I fear at the same time it may decrease the chances that we'll get the kind of global monitoring system that decreases the chances of an attack in the first place. I don't know, climate change, it's a good question. I think it will on balance harm, if indeed we're seeing a Cold War with China.
Yeah.
That will probably decrease the chances of, the kind of international cooperation you need on that. I have, before we go, I have a statistical question for you. Hate to put you on the spot.
You should have warned me in advance.
I should have warned you, but this has to do with, I got caught, saying something incorrect And I now understand what the technically correct version of it is, but here's what it was. It was, there was this study of this drug remdesivir, and they said, well, it did decrease the chances of death, but that was not statistically significant.
Yeah.
And the point I made in this podcast with Mickey Kaus, the main point I wanted to make was, look, you shouldn't think of statistical significance as binary. They have chosen this 5% threshold. But if it's just barely over the 5% threshold, that's barely over. And if it's barely shy of it, that's almost like being barely over it. As it happens, this was, as it turned out, as I later found out, this was just barely shy of the threshold. And moreover, it might have reached the threshold, but they stopped the experiment once they were convinced it was doing some good for ethical reasons, because they didn't want to deprive people of remdesivir. So anyway, but what I said that was wrong was, I said, look, what a 5% thing would tell you is that you can say, with 95% confidence that it will decrease the chances of death by this amount or greater. Now, do you see the flaw in the way I've put that? There is a flaw, apparently. This is unfair. This is unfair what I've done.
It's unfair. So tell me what the flaw is, and I'll nod approvingly.
You do not get points for this.
This is how I earn the big bucks.
You do not. You have not passed the test. Maybe if you change your background to an even more academic looking one,
like a lab.
Yeah, that would lend credibility to your nod. But it turns out you can't. It isn't. You can't. The part that you're not supposed to say is the chances are 95%. That anything. You're not supposed to start the sentence that way. What you're supposed to say is, if you ask, what are the chances that actually remdesivir doesn't decrease the chances, and yet we nonetheless got results this dramatic indicating it does? What are the chances of that? The chances of that are only 5%. The chances that the null hypothesis is true, but we got these results affirming the opposite of the null hypothesis, the hypothesis, are only 5%.
Yeah.
Now that turns out not to be the same as saying we can say with 95% confidence that the hypothesis is true.
No. The statistics, to zoom in, the statistical significance does not tell you whether or not your hypothesis is correct or not.
Well, it doesn't even give you, it apparently doesn't even give you the right to say there is a certain percentage chance of that.
It doesn't bear on your hypothesis in any interesting way. What it does is it addresses the question. You're comparing two groups, and you have two piles of numbers. And it says, it addresses the issue in some way whether these numbers were drawn from different samples, whether there's a real difference between them. And it doesn't say why there's a real difference. It doesn't say what direction the real difference is, which one gets bigger. It's just that there's a real difference as opposed to null hypothesis, which is you're drawing from the same sample. So suppose I have two groups, and one of them I do nothing. They're sick. And the other one, they're sick. And I randomly separate two groups. And then when I say a prayer over. Well, some proportion of the time, one time out of 20, right, the group I said a prayer over will do better than the other group.
Well, right. But my question is, if you know that one time in 20 and only one time in 20, I mean, that we know, I think, but just by virtue, I mean, of course, you have to make some simplifying assumptions. You have to say the division of the groups into two was truly random.
Yep.
There are no, there was nothing about the process of selection that would have biased the groups in any ways relevant to the outcome of this experiment. You have to assume that. And you can't always assume that, like, for example, in opinion polls, and when people may have different reasons for not picking up the phone or refusing to talk to you that may be related to their political views, but leave that aside. If you assume that none of that is in play, then you can say, what the chances are, like how many times, 1 in 20, whatever, when you have this sample size and here's the size of the total population. Okay, total population 300 million, sample size 5,000. You can or the two sample sizes in the case of random selection. You can say what the chances are that you would get results of a certain magnitude by chance alone. I still don't understand why you can't translate that into some statement about the likelihood that your hypothesis is correct. Now, I'm willing to concede that maybe if what you know is that there's only a 5% chance that if the null hypothesis were true, you'd get these results. I'm willing to concede that maybe that doesn't translate into specifically a 95% level of confidence in your hypothesis. What I don't understand is why it can't be translated into some level of confidence, into some statement of the form, look, X% of the time that you get these results, it's going to turn out that they are representative of the universal population that these samples were drawn from. I just think intuitively it must be the case that you can say something like that. I am not giving up on this, Paul.
Okay. Rather than take this head on, I'll make a distinction, which is worth knowing. And this will be the first time in a Wright show this distinction has been made. We're talking about statistical significance, which is basically the odds of whether or not something will happen by chance or not by chance.
Right.
There's a separate concept, which is actually really important, and nobody ever talks about this.
Confidence interval or no?
Effect size, which is how big the difference is.
Mm-hmm.
So there could be a drug that would increase your chance of surviving a pandemic by a fraction of a percent.
Mm-hmm.
But if we tested a big enough sample, we could have tremendously significant findings. But it's a really significant findings, but a small effect.
Right.
You could also have, 0.05 or 0.1 for that matter, and have an enormous effect. So this is the odds are sort of 1 in 10 that this is chance, but if it's true, it's this enormous effect. And both concepts are important. The odds of being right and the odds of, and if you're right, how big an effect is, are both really important for sort of interventions.
Yeah, actually, I may have misstated something earlier. I mean, there's also the question, like if you get a very big effect size in your sample, you can ask the question, well, what are the chances that there is an effect of some size in this direction? In other words, given this sharp decrease in death rate with a sample this size, what are the chances that there is at least some increase, change in the death rate in this direction?
Yeah.
But at this point, I'm too confused to even know which of these it is kind of standard for the statistical analysis to shed light on. I mean, they're different questions, but related.
You're right. One thing you said was very true and is important, which is that we talk about statistically significant and non-significant. So I write an article, I say these effects were significant, these weren't, and I talk about it in a binary way, like you say someone should be allowed to drink and someone shouldn't. But like that example, it is a socially arbitrary point. And a lot of psychologists and statisticians have pointed out that we should have different levels of significance for different things. So for different questions, depending on the cost-benefit analysis. Suppose something would be, if you were wrong about something, it would be disastrous.
This is super hypothetical, I should add.
Yes. Okay. If you were wrong, it would be disastrous. Mm-hmm. You'd want a very high significance level. On the other hand, if it was something where if you were right, it would be fantastic.
Right.
But if you were wrong, it wouldn't be such a big deal. Suppose the claim is that eating an extra carrot each day cures cancer.
Yeah.
And suppose you found at 0.05. Well, by all means, eat a lot of carrots. That sounds great. But for other things, the cost-benefit ratio shifts around. In more mature sciences like physics, they won't take you seriously unless you have a significance ratio of like 0.00000 and a long stream till you get to 1. Well, psychology has settled on 0.05. There's been a movement to change this to 0.01.
Yeah. Well,
and then the trade-off is you will publish fewer false findings, but you will miss out on certain true findings.
Yeah. Well, if your average sample is 14 undergraduates at an American college, you just really can't demand too much in the way of the
we do better than that, Bob. Now we have 14 people online.
Oh, okay. Well, that's much better.
Yeah.
Because we know that'll be a random sample. So sorry to, I don't know. I continue. I'm holding out. I really think there should be something you can say of the form. When you get results like this, it will turn out, if you imagine God coming down and telling you whether the results you got are reflected in the, to some extent at least, in the general population, that will turn out to be the case X times out of 100 or whatever. I just have to think that there's a statement of that form that you could infer from the statistics, and I ain't giving up.
So I'll tell you something, and there's people to listen to on this, like Daniel Atkins is a very smart guy who does work on statistics and methodology and so on. He's active on Twitter and, has a lot to say. It's the sort of thing where everybody says people talk about significance wrong. Mm-hmm. And then the experts say, and here's what 0.05, people 0.05 means. And then they always say something subtly different than the next person. And there's sort of a way to talk about it, which is the correct way. But it's not the odds of your hypothesis being correct. You could have the difference between the groups that your hypothesis predicts, but your hypothesis itself might be wrong.
Well, your hypothesis, there's always a chance your hypothesis could be wrong. That's the whole point of this, since you didn't study the entire population. But I mean, I guess I would say, like with public opinion polling, if you make the obviously false assumption that your selection is actually random, which it never is, but assume it's like randomly picking balls out of a jar, and then with that assumption in hand, I thought it was the case that you could say that the chances are X, this percent, that the real results in the population at large are within, 2 percentage points on either side of our finding. I thought you could begin a statement like that. Say the chances are this percent that this finding is blah, 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 that you are allowed to begin that statement that way. I thought, and if so, I don't see these two questions as fundamentally different, but.
Well, I'll give you a reason why you can't do that, which is, imagine you want to compare two samples, Democrats and Republicans, and you scooped up the samples. But imagine the way the world works is for everything you're interested in, they are exactly identical. That's just that's the truth of this. So
actually, Democrats and Republicans don't differ along any observable variable? For
all the variables you are interested in. So suppose you're interested in sensitivity to different smells or spices or something like that. And it turns out that's the truth. Then you do 20 independent statistical tests looking for a difference. The odds are that at least one of them will turn out to be significant by chance.
Well, it depends on your sample size.
No, if significant has happened, if you get a false positive 1 out of 20 times, and then you do 20 tests, you're going to find some false positives just by chance.
Well, right, but I mean, let's say your whole universe is 1,000 Democrats and 1,000 Republicans.
That's the whole universe, yeah.
If you sample 10 of each, then it's going to be, your chances are probably more than 1 in 20 of getting something by chance alone that seems significant but isn't. But if you sample 900 of each, that number goes down, right?
No.
Well, you're saying that this is what a 5% statistical significance thing means.
That's right.
Okay.
That's just what it means.
Yeah. Okay.
But it sets up the sort of paradoxical spot, and this is actually a problem in actual psychology. This is not a hypothetical, where it used to be one of the problems with replication crisis is a guy like me would do a study, would have like 15 different statistical tests. One of them would work out by chance. And then I build a paper around that.
Right. There's
a story, I forget who it is, of a statistician who looked at this enormous data set and found, for medical reasons, since they was looking to see for gender differences in heart condition or so on. And he was then asked, could you break it up into like looking at, say, you know, different ethnicities, different parts of the country? And he said, no, because once I break it up, the odds of getting spurious findings by chance grow. He says, I could break up an astrological sign, right, and I'll guarantee you will find statistically significantly Aries do better than Sagittarius.
Yeah.
You know, so
I've always thought that like retrospective selection of variables has a kind of utility. You should just be honest about it. You should say, I found this one thing, and now somebody else should go do an experiment where that's the hypothesis being tested.
I think you're right.
You shouldn't act like it was the hypothesis being tested.
Right. But the problem with replication crisis is the paper would never be reported as just a crazy-ass thing we never would have expected this happened.
Right.
Rather, people, because we're faulty creatures, we're not sneaks, but we're faulty creatures. You write it, you deal with the data, that's as you're finding. You sit in a lab meeting, all of a sudden, that's exactly what you would have expected. That, you know, that men do better than women, except it's on a weekday, then women do better than men. Mm-hmm. And then you build a paper around that. So one solution that psychologists have come to is pre-registration. It's the equivalent of calling your shots. You put in a publicly available repository, we predict this. Now, if you get something else, you still report it.
Right.
But then it's out there as an accident, and people take it, you didn't predict it, so it could have happened, more likely to have happened randomly, and then you build from that.
Well, a related thing is, given that in the online world, it doesn't cost you anything to publish data, why shouldn't everybody just now post all their data? And I mean, especially when money's on the line, like when this, what was it? Moderna is the name of that company that said, oh, we have meaningful vaccine results. And they may well, I'm not saying they don't, but they kind of describe them in sketchy way, and their stock goes up by 5%. It's like, shouldn't the Securities and Exchange Commission say, if you are a corporation that reports financially significant results, you have to, the moment you've said anything, all the data have to be online. What would be wrong with that?
Nothing. I think practically for a guy like me, sometimes you just mess around. You try to see if this works, and then you follow up something that works. And you're not going to publish everything like an experimental paper. But for something like a medical test, where it's really important, what you don't want to do is, you know, try it this way, try it this way, try it this way. And then by number 10, it works. Report it as if none of the other 9 had ever happened.
Now, what is exactly does the term P hacking mean? P is the number, the variable for statistical significance, right? What does P hacking refer to? Something that because it is one of the great scourges of psychology in the recent past, apparently. Does it refer to one of the things you've just described, one of the abuses?
It refers to, typically unintentionally, without any malice, doing statistics on all your data sooner or later, and then look for things that are significant.
Okay, so
if you do enough tests, sooner or later, you'll do it.
So you can either redo the test until you get a good P, or you can look for which variable happened to have a good P. Is that both of those are P hacking?
Both of those would be P hacking.
Yeah.
There's a range of sins that come out. Typically, it's you have a data set, and you just kind of look around. You look at it every which way, and some stuff tends to work. So there was a paper that got the replication crisis going, and I think it's I did not do my homework on this. I think it's by Joe Simmons and his colleagues, published in Psych Science. And it was a paper that blew everybody's mind. And it traumatized the field.
What was the finding?
The finding was that if you listen to the Beatles song, When I'm 64,
backwards, it says Paul is dead. No, different.
When you listen to the song When I'm 64, you end up getting older. And
getting older and
samples that listened to When I'm 64 turned out to be older than those who didn't. The point being, I got to tell you the punchline of the point being, what they did was they simply had a bunch of people look at When I'm 64, listen to the song, and others didn't, And then they did a whole bunch of analyses. And then they said, this is our finding. And their point was an existence proof. If you had do enough analyses, you could find every study will be used something interesting and non-intuitive. So take a drug. You take a drug, you give half of the people a drug, half of the people no drug. There's no difference. But you're not happy with that. So you see, did it cause a difference in men? What about women? What about right-handers versus left-handers? People from urban versus rural? You keep looking. If your sample size is big enough, pretty soon you find, oh my God, colorblind people are affected by the drug. And is that a real finding? Well, maybe, but such findings are going to appear no matter what. I mean,
I still like the idea of looking for this stuff. It's like when when you've got a ton of genomic data, for example.
Absolutely.
And if you have a database, and ideally anonymized for purposes of privacy, but if you have people's DNA sequences and the diseases they've had, that is valuable stuff. And you should look for correlations. But then once you found the correlations,
that's right.
That's when the serious study begins.
That's right. And I know a lot of people who do studies. They don't pre-register them. They look for a lot of things. They have ideas of what they're doing. That's why they're doing study. And then once they get a result, they do study 2, which is pre-registered, and said, we predict that there'll be an effect among colorblind people and non-colorblind people. And then if you get it, then you're dealing something real.
Right. Now, is pre-registering really catching on?
In some fields of psychology more than others, in some journals more than others.
I mean, why not all? Why shouldn't it be done by everyone?
I pre-register most of my studies. Some are simply meant to be exploratory.
Yeah, well, that's a valid thing, I guess. I guess what I would say is, why not just say we're only going to publish pre-registered studies? The others are exploratory.
You might want to publish exploratory studies.
Okay.
I'll give you an example of some research done in my lab, led by Maddie Wilkes, who's a postdoc. We're interested in kids who choose to become vegetarian. So there's a small population of kids who become vegetarian even though their parents eat meat. So we have a lot of data from those kids. We compare them to kids who just regularly eat meat and kids who are vegetarian because their parents are vegetarian. And we're interested in a whole bunch of different possible differences in disgust sensitivity, in intelligence and so on. So we lay a whole bunch of tests on them. And we've actually pre-registered this because we wanted to be clear what we're going to do, what our analyses were. But in some way, it's kind of exploratory. We have some ideas we're playing around with. Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm glad I, without warning you at all,
that was something,
coerced you into having a little seminar on stats, because it was good for me. I ain't giving up on my position.
There are so many of my colleagues, if they listen this long and they hear me associated with the phrase seminar and stats, and it would just really
be hilarious.
Yeah. I keep up, but I'm not a stats maven.
Well, I wish we could keep going, but it looks like those flowers behind you need watering, Paul.
That's right. I also have to reorder my books.
Also, those books could use reordering. Listen, you've got a great idea. The one where you get to choose the books. A little Zoom backdrop.
I'm not going to name names, but on Twitter, somebody I know posted a little thing saying, just chill in with my morning coffee, and sitting down there with morning coffee. And behind him is a bookshelf. And you have never seen a more curated set of books, Got a bit of Malcolm X, some Frege, some good philosophy, good novels, a little bit of something funny there, some feminist literature. Everything was perfectly catered. And I'm thinking, how long did it take him to do that?
It's probably just a Zoom background.
It's probably it is a great business.
But it's definitely become kind of a pastime of mine now that everybody on the cable news networks is being interviewed from their homes, is like checking out like what their bookshelf says, not about their actual reading habits, of course, but about the image they're trying to project. And
I know what you're looking for. I know what you're looking for. You could get a sense of what your books look like from that angle. And you kind of peek and say, is that the moral animal?
Hey, I did see one of my books. I didn't see it. Somebody called to my attention on Chris Hayes' show, MSNBC. I forget whoever it was who had it on their bookshelf. I now followed them on Twitter. I now trust them as a guide. to all things.
Very nice. Very nice.
Yeah.
I had heard from somebody, this is a friend of a friend story, but that they saw a book by a famous cognitive psychologist in a porn video. Because sometimes these videos have background. And
better than the other way around. Better than a cognitive psychologist on cable news having a porn video in the background.
Yes, there we go. Okay.
All right. Well, thank you, Paul. This has been illuminating as always. I'll let you get back to your Canadian paradise with its fake backgrounds and
it's open to you, Bob. Whenever you want. You
okay. I may be borrowing one of your backgrounds any moment. Okay. Thanks. See you next time.
See you next time.